Well, thank you very much for coming on this very nice spring afternoon. And can you hear me? Am I projecting to the back? Can you hear me okay? Okay, we are taping this event, as we've been doing for the last several years. And as a result, you'll be able to see an encore of the lecture, which many of you may want to do, on the web in about a week and a half or 2 weeks. There's one implication of that, and that is when you're asking questions following the lecture, we will be passing around a microphone. You won't hear your voice amplified in the room. This is strictly to feed into the digital tape, into the digital copy, okay? But when you are asking questions, please identify yourself and wait for the microphone, and you will therefore be preserved for perpetuity in the internet world. It's a great pleasure to welcome you this afternoon. My name is Richard Norton. I'm a professor at Boston University in the Departments of International Relations and Anthropology. It's been my pleasure for many years to chair the Campagna-Kerven Lecture on modern Turkey. And this is a lecture which began in the mid-1990s and is usually conducted every spring. And we pride ourselves in bringing in some of the very finest talents on Turkey, journalists, businessmen, scholars, and so on. Writers, Elif Shafak, for example, was here a couple of years ago. And we have a very, very special guest this evening who very much, if you will, lives up to the usual billing for the lecture. Before I introduce our speaker, however, I'd like to talk a little bit about the two men who are the, if you will, the namesakes for the lecture, just very briefly. One is a man by the name of Mehmet Nahid Kerven, who was one of the original Young Turks. He as a young man, spent time in prison. He was an army officer, spent time in Paris, was an intellectual, was a contemporary of Ataturk and İsmet İnönü. Late in life, he was a director of the National Bank of Turkey, maintained a sort of intellectual orientation throughout his life, including a monograph that he wrote that I found in 1933 on the French thinker Condorcet. And he is the father of Suzanne Campagna, who's with us tonight. And it's always a kind of spring ritual to welcome Suzanne to Boston. I've been lucky enough to know her now for a number of years, and one of the great dividends of this lecture for me is a very special friendship with Miss Suzanne Campagna, who spent much of her younger life in Paris, as well as in Istanbul, and then for many years has resided in Washington, D.C. The second namesake for the lecture, Gerard Campagna, or Jerry Campagna, was the husband of Mrs. Campagna. He's a man who grew up in a small town in New Hampshire and went to college at Assumption College, taught French for a while, ended up becoming commissioned as an officer, and during the Second World War, among other places, found himself stationed in Paris, where he met his bride-to-be, Suzanne Campagna. They married and came to the States. Mr. Campagna spent a good part of his young life here at Boston University working on his PhD in history, which he wrote on the international relations of Turkey, as a matter of fact. And he went on to a career in government, particularly as an analyst of Turkish events and so on. So it's these two gentlemen, now unfortunately both deceased, who provide the name hyphenated name for the lecture series, the Campagna-Kerven Lecture Series. So now let me turn to our speaker for this evening, and this is Henri Barkey. If you watch the television news, CNN and that sort of thing, I'm sure you've seen him on various shows, the NewsHour and ABC News and so on. He's one of the foremost scholars on Turkish politics in the United States. He's the chair of the Department of International Relations at Lehigh University. He's also served in government, so he's one of these people who has had a career on the academic side as well as on the government side, so that in the late 1990s, concluding in 2000, he was a member of the policy planning staff at the State Department. He's taught over the course of his career at Princeton University, Columbia, and the State University of New York, as well as the University of Pennsylvania. He's a co-author or author of several books, including Turkey's Kurdish Question. He's the editor of Reluctant Neighbor, Turkey's Role in the Middle East, and the author of The State and the Industrialization Crisis in Turkey. Also, if you read the journal literature on Turkey, you've seen his articles in places like Middle East Policy, the Middle East Journal, World Policy Journal, the Journal of Democracy, and so on. And he's going to talk to us tonight about U.S.-Turkish relations. He'll talk for 35 or 40 minutes or so, and then we'll take some time for questions. Following the question and answer period, there will be a reception with appropriate libations in another room here in the castle, and some hors d'oeuvres and so on. So please stay for that as well. So thank you very much for coming tonight, and please help me in welcoming Henri Barkey.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and Mrs. Campagna, thank you very much for organizing such a wonderful event, especially in the spring, and I'm sure you have something to do with the weather. The other thing I have to say, listening to Richard's introduction, it seems to me that everybody who's associated with this lecture series ends up in Paris somehow. So I'm looking forward to that eventually. This is also the first time I think I'm going to give a lecture and watch myself at the same time, which is disheartening. I'm going to talk about the Turkish-American relations, and as it's known to you, most of you, it has been rough of late. And there's been a series of problems. There's been lots of misunderstanding, lots of accusations across each other's borders. And I'm happy to report as an academic that it ain't over yet, which means will be continuously employed for a long time. No, jokes aside, the truth is that it is serious, but there is also, in the near future, and we'll talk at the end, maybe in the question and answer period, I predict one of the first crises that the new president in the United States will have to confront will be Turkey. And we can talk about that later and how to deal with this. As most of you know, last year there was a Pew public opinion poll that had this startling statistic that only 9% of Turkey's population had a favorable opinion of the United States. And what, of course, is actually shocking is that there was a similar poll in 1999, at the end of the Clinton years, where 50% of Turks, more than 50% of Turks, had a positive view of the United States. So what happened in between? Now, at the very simple answer I can give you a very simple answer and say it's George W. Bush, and I can close and go home now, and I don't think Richard will be happy. But the truth is that it is actually a complex story. It is the result of three sets or three categories of problems. One is a changing international system. The other one is changing perceptions of each other. And thirdly, differences over core national interest issues. And now what I will do is I will talk about all of them, try to separate them, but in reality, all three are integrated, are inseparable. I mean, it's not that easy to make those distinctions. So let me start with the kind of the broader picture and talk a little bit about what do I mean by the change in the international system. And obviously, we academics, we keep pointing to the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War was important for Turkish-American relations because Turkey was a member of NATO and was a frontline state against the Soviet Union. And the Cold War had a very distinct architecture. I mean, you knew exactly where you stood. You could predict foreign policy. I mean, life probably in the State Department in those days was probably very easy. You didn't have to deal with a huge number of problems. I mean, it was the good old days. You know, you knew exactly where you stood. But Turkey had a very, very special role in that architecture. That doesn't mean that there were no problems between Turkey and the United States along the way. There were. But by and large, the lines, if you want, of communication were very, very clear. Now, 20 years ago, the Cold War ended, but people automatically assumed that immediately after the Cold War that there would be this new world order that George Bush Sr. had talked about. The truth is, it takes time for a new world order to emerge. I don't think it has yet emerged. We're still going through many spasms. And in fact, one of the things we do know is that with the end of the Cold War, a whole new series of crises were generated by the end of the Cold War. The most obvious ones are obviously Iraq, 1990-91, the first Gulf War. The other one is Yugoslavia. But there was a great deal of apprehension in Turkey as the Cold War ended. A colleague of mine in Oxford, Philip Robbins, wrote a book on Turkish foreign policy, and he makes this very interesting observation that whereas in Europe, the end of the destruction of the Berlin Wall was received with jubilation and ecstasy, in Turkey people were quiet. There was a great deal of apprehension precisely because there was a fear that Turkey's role in the world, and especially in this architecture, Cold War architecture, would be damaged, because if you're no longer a frontline state, are you that important? The irony, of course, is that Turkey became even more important to the United States and to the West after the end of the Cold War. You can look at it from two different perspectives. One is that Turkey was an island of stability in a sea of instability. All you had to do is look at the post-Cold War environment. You had the Balkans, you had the Caucasus, and you had the Middle East. All three areas had their own problems, most of them violent. Iraq, we talked about, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Yugoslavia. Right? So Turkey was this island of stability, a country the United States and the West could count on to project both a sense of, you know, things can work out and project influence. On the other aspect, of course, is that there was always this perennial sibling rivalry, if you want, between Greece and Turkey. You know, Turkey was always the 10-year-old and Greece was the 7-year-old. The reason I say this is because, because in US government, for every $10 of aid we gave to the Turks, we had to give 7 to the Greeks. So we had these two kids, and they were always, like two siblings, they would fight all the time. But what happened after the end of the Cold War is that Greece completely lost its importance for the United States. Greece had no role to play, maybe marginally in the Balkans, and that role was not actually very constructive as far as the United States was concerned. So therefore, in terms of its importance relative to Greece, but its importance relative to the region, Turkey's importance increased. And it's very interesting that the Turks actually took a very, very long time to appreciate this transformation. But it may be that the Turkish establishment, and I will distinguish between the Turkish establishment and the Turkish public in general, we'll talk about that later, may have had reasons to worry. Maybe they knew something we didn't know. And if you look at two major forces that were unleashed by the Cold War, and again, remember, we don't have a new post-Cold War architecture yet. I think we're still trying to find our way, but what we do know is some of the things that emerged. The two major forces that came out of the end of the Cold War was nationalism, the re-emergence, if you want, nationalism, and micro-nationalism or ethnic nationalism, And the other one is the importance of religion. But also the context changed. What do I mean by that? The context, whereas in the old days, during the Cold War, the nature of the NATO alliance, the nature of the rivalry with the Soviet Union was such that all these issues of nationalism, etc., were contained. I mean, Yugoslavia existed. I mean, although it was, we saw the. Somebody's trying to tell me something. But so these forces were contained. But once the Cold War was over, there was no longer reasons not to pay attention to nationalism. There was no reason to say, you little nations that want independence or that want autonomy should stay back. And for Turkey, in particular, the truth is these two forces hit at the two most important fault lines that existed in Turkey. One is the fact that the notion that there was the two foundational myths, if you want, or founding myths of Turkey, that everybody in Turkey is a Turk, that there are no differences in terms of ethnicity, etc. And two, the fact that Turkey was a secular, or the way the Turks define it, a laïque, in the French way, a hardline secular country. But immediately after the Cold War, and I should also stress that this is not, in Turkey, a completely post-Cold War phenomenon, but in the post-Cold War era, what did we see? The emergence of re-emergence, I should say, of Kurdish nationalism, and the emergence of religious parties, and the emergence of religious forces in Turkey. And at least we see with mutations and permutations where both have come, essentially. There is still in Turkey a serious Kurdish problem, and there's a serious problem with Islam, as we're experiencing now with the attempted closure of the ruling party because presumably it has an Islamist agenda. So the post-Cold War era essentially affected Turkey where it was most vulnerable. Those two areas were things, the Kurdish issue and Islam, were things that were kept under wraps for a very, very long time. Now, when I say under wraps, if you look at the Kurdish issue specifically, it isn't that the Kurds had made their peace and suddenly had become Turks. It's just that we did not hear about it. We did not hear about it because to some extent it was not convenient. To some extent, it was not the age of CNN on YouTube and all these other nice inventions that we have now. But it is also the fact that almost from the beginning of the Turkish Republic, you've had Kurdish activism in one shape or form continuously. You had rebellions lots of rebellions, but three big ones, 1925, 30, 1937. But more interesting to me, more than the rebellions, and then of course you have the PKK emerging in the 1980s, continuing to this day. But I actually think more interesting than these rebellions is also what was happening politically in terms of the Kurdish community. And I'll give you a couple of examples. There were Kurdish MPs who were elected to the Turkish parliament under regular parties, center-right parties, center-left parties, and the assumption they're behaving like normal Turkish MPs. No, they were not. I mean, they were fundamentally Kurdish MPs trying to get goodies, trying to get protecting their own population. There was a very, very strong sense of Kurdishness, not in a national way, but there was a very strong of helping your community, and political activism, especially in the quiet periods like the 1950s and part of the 1960s, was very, very high. But we missed it. We as academics, we missed it. Policymakers missed it. Because in part, those of you who know Turkey very well know that in the 1950s, 1960s, 70s, and most of the 80s, the word Kurd was never used in the daily lexicon. There was no such thing as a Kurd. So you can imagine also what a shock it is to the Turkish public and the Turkish establishment who had convinced itself that there were no Kurds. Recently, this is actually very interesting. Recently, a document was found among the papers of the now deceased Prime Minister Ecevit. And Ecevit has had a long and distinguished career in Turkish politics. And this document was actually interesting. It was a document that was prepared by the 1960 coup makers that talked about relocating people from the southeast, people who, and then the exact quote is, who wrongly think they are Kurds, to other parts of the country. In 1980, when there was another coup, one of the coup leaders, Bülent Ulusoy, who would then become prime minister, he was chief of the Navy, and then, as luck would have it, he had to retire on the 30th of August, and the coup was on 12 days later. He told a journalist, and that interview was not published for many, many years, said, one of the primary reasons we had to intervene in 1980 was because every time we went to the southeast, people in the southeast, these are the Kurdish areas of Turkey, people in the southeast greeted us as we were an occupying army. So the place was boiling. It's just that we didn't see it. I mean, look at all the academic books that were written on Turkey during those years. We completely missed this picture. Islam is different. Islam also was suppressed, but it existed. It existed in terms of tarikats, these religious societies. People were organized. People knew. I mean, and in some ways we know, for example, that Turgut Özal, for instance, was a member of one of these religious orders and brought people who were close to him. I mean, but Özal was an interesting phenomenon. So what I'm saying is that with the end of the Cold War, and that's the first, shall we say, the end of my first part, the end of the Cold War open up, if you want, all these forces to come up to the surface, and has created a major crisis in the Turkish psyche. I mean, as a result, because of these two, you have a great deal of sense of insecurity on the part of the establishment. And by the establishment, I mean the civilian and military bureaucracy, certain elements of most of the media, most of the business, Istanbul-based business classes. But this angst about what's going on and an insecurity. And that has, which comes from as my second point, that has moved us to the question of perceptions. But one more thing I would like to emphasize here. One thing, United States also changed with the end of the Cold War. I mean, we have this latent hubris, if you want, or late blooming hubris with this administration. We also have a sense of, obviously, of the unilateralism that comes that we can do things nobody else can do. And ergo, we go into Iraq and pull out of Kyoto and stuff like that. So there's also, in that sense, American foreign policy has changed as a result and has become much more, on the Bush at least, this in French would say, je m'en fichisme, I don't care about the others. But one thing that is common to both countries is that domestic politics plays a much more important role now in the making of foreign policy than ever before. In part, with the end of the Cold War, what we used to talk about here in this country about bipartisanship, or partisanship ends at the edge of the ocean or the waters, that's gone. And that's why you can see, for example, the Armenian genocide resolution becoming a major domestic political issue and being at least attempted to be voted on a number of times. Similarly, in Turkey, the Turkish government has become far more responsive to Turkish political pressure, and we saw this especially in this past year, in 2007, with the resurgence of PKK activity in the Turkish southeast and the pressure on the Turkish government to do something to intervene in Iraq. All right, so let me move to issue number 2, which is changing perceptions, and this fits with the the sense of insecurity that we see in Turkey. Now, remember what I said about these new forces emerging. I mean, clearly, maybe it's luck, or should we say lack of luck. Look what the first crisis after 1990, after the end of the Cold War, brought us. The war in Iraq. Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. There's a big coalition that goes after him. The Shia in the south and the Kurds in the north rebel. We end up with a no-fly zone in the north, which is with American and British planes flying from a Turkish Air Force base in Adana, in Turkish south. Essentially, the first post-Cold War crisis is the one crisis that the Turks feared the most, which was the emergence of an autonomous and possibly ultimately an independent Kurdish state. Now, 20% of Turkey's population is supposed to be Kurdish. Now, that doesn't mean that every single person of those 14 million is a fire-breathing, firebrand Kurdish nationalist. Some have lost their identity, some are very happy, have assumed kind of a dual identity, and some of them are firebrand, some of them are very active. But the fear in Turkey was that with the creation of this no-fly statelet in northern Iraq, that this would undermine Turkey's cohesion. Now, it is, I don't want to, maybe at the end, if we question and answer, we can go into that. I don't want to go into the details why the Turks may think, may be right or may be wrong about this. But it is that context which further inflamed the sense of insecurity and the sense that the world is against us. But this is also the time, and I want to go back to 1999 when the United States had 50% approval rating, so to say. And I should say, by the way, I also looked at polls from the early 1990s. Turkey did not have, the United States did not have such high ratings. It was in the 30s and 40s at most. What happened in 1999 was President Bill Clinton. President Clinton did two things. One, he delivered to Turkey Abdullah Öcalan. Abdullah Öcalan, the head of the PKK, had been forced out of Syria and was on a whirlwind tour, and he ended up in the Greek embassy in Kenya, probably taking a safari at the expense of Greek taxpayer money. But the truth is we found him there. And we delivered him to Turkey. So, and there was a great deal of appreciation because Öcalan had become the focal point of all Turkish anger. And in fact, after Öcalan's arrest, etc., the PKK decided to call a ceasefire, so at least deaths in the southeast had declined. But that was a very unique moment. The other thing is that he went to Turkey. He went to Turkey also at the time after this horrible, I don't know if you remember, earthquake. Well, we still don't know how many people died in that earthquake, but it was a devastating earthquake. And he did something, all Turks will tell you, he did something most Turkish officials never do. When the Turkish president or the Turkish prime minister in those days would go and visit people, they'd be standing here and they would keep the folks way behind, way over there. He just walked among and just did what American politicians do, kissing babies, shaking hands. And one of the most vivid pictures is actually this little kid who grabbed his rather large nose like this. And that was, and people would say, in those days would say that if Clinton would run for the presidency, since his term was up a year later, he probably would win in a landslide in Turkey if he wanted to become Turkey's president. Maybe Hillary would be running now in Turkey too. So that's what explains that 50%. But from then on, a couple of things changed. One is 9/11. 9/11 changed America, obviously. But until 9/11, right, when you look at the different constituencies in Turkey, everybody liked the United States because they saw something in the United States they liked. The nationalists liked us because we gave Öcalan. The Kurds liked us because during the Clinton years, even though we delivered Öcalan, and that was towards the end, they liked us because we pushed very, very hard in the Clinton years for freedom of speech. We pushed on using the European Union. We pushed on issues of torture, etc. And this is very important. The Islamists in Turkey liked us very much. They liked us very much because, again, because of free speech, because of these things, we took a very principled position. When the current Prime Minister of Turkey was the mayor of Istanbul, and he was sent to jail for reading a poem that, if any one of you were to read it, you'll be applauded as a great, it would be a great feat. But when he read it, it was interpreted as an Islamist poem, and he went to jail. We roundly criticized him. We sent the Consul General in Istanbul to visit him just before he went. I mean, we did a lot of symbolic things to point. We were the only country that criticized the closing down of the parties. Even the European Union did not criticize when the Islamist party from which Mr. Erdogan came was closed down. So we took a principled position. But 9/11 overnight changed this. It was very interesting. I mean, every day I read Turkish newspapers, and you have to read 10 Turkish newspapers to figure out what's going on because every one of them has their own little slant. But you could tell the day after 9/11, the Islamist press changed. The Islamist press changed and became amazingly anti-American. And in a way, when you ask yourself, why is it? I mean, in general, people in Turkey, just like in the Middle East, cannot believe that 19 hijackers from Arab hijackers could do this. In part for the Turks, it's something, these Arabs can't do anything right. How can they pull this one off? So it must be some bigger force, i.e. CIA, Mossad, doing it. And to this day, a lot of people in Turkey, like in the Arab world, believe that. And more importantly, what was interesting to me, why did Islamists change? And I think because in one way they may have been right, and that is that they understood that 9/11 was a major turning point. That it was the beginning of a war, if you want, between the West and the East, between Christendom and Islam to some extent. And you can argue that the way we've conducted the war in Iraq, etc., there's no reason why they shouldn't think that way. That somehow this would be used. But of course then came the war in Iraq and came Abu Ghraib and then Guantanamo. So whatever prestige we had in Turkey just went down the chute. But fundamentally, and I come to my third point and I will weave all these things in. Fundamentally, the problems we have with Turkey today have to do with one very critical issue, and that's northern Iraq. And I had to give a paper recently, and they asked me to talk about, what's the situation, the problem is the United States and America, and what can go wrong, etc. And the title I gave was, "It's the Kurds Stupid." The truth is that is a fundamental issue that divides the United States and Turkey, and all it has to do with Iraq and what happens to northern Iraq. The war in Iraq has now put Turkey and the United States on really very different tracks. Now, it is also true that in Turkey there's a new government that came to power in 2002 that has a different vision. I mean, in terms of how it wants to conduct foreign policy, has a different vision of its own role, and in a way much healthier role, if you want, than its predecessor. It is not as defensive as its predecessors were, but also in some ways clashes with the United States in different ways. That said, northern Iraq and what will happen to northern Iraq really goes to the heart of the Turkish-American relationship. And what we haven't, and what the United States has been completely incapable of doing, has been to create or start a dialogue over northern Iraq with the Turks. This has to be a dialogue, and I'll talk about the reasons, but this is a dialogue that has to be a dialogue of honesty. I mean, this administration has to come and tell the Turks, we messed up in Iraq, we need your help, but we also understand there's northern Iraq, and we have different visions of northern Iraq. Let me talk about northern Iraq. Northern Iraq poses three problems for the Turks. One is the PKK. The PKK has, and as you know, the Turks have been bombing the PKK now since December in northern Iraq. The truth is, this is one aspect of the Kurdish problem. It's a domestic aspect of the Kurdish problem in Turkey. There are PKK fighters in northern Iraq, but there are also as many in Turkey proper as well. The second issue is the fate of the Turkoman Kurds, or Turkmens, Turkish-speaking Iraqis who live in the city of Kirkuk. Kirkuk is now the focal point between Kurdish demands and the rest of Iraq, and especially the Turkmen. The city of Kirkuk is in dispute, but most importantly, Kirkuk has a lot of oil. And two pipelines from Kirkuk go through Turkey into the Mediterranean. And the fear that the Turks have is that if Kirkuk becomes part of the Kurdish regional government that exists now, that will be one step towards Kurdish independence. It's a reasonable argument. But the Kurds will say to you, look, the province of Kirkuk, not just the city, the province of Kirkuk has always been majority Kurdish. The city of Kirkuk, well, they claim it was majority Kurdish, but the truth is nobody had a majority in Kirkuk. The Turkmen or the Arabs or the Kurds. But Saddam over the years did so much manipulation. Moved people out, replaced them. There were huge numbers of displaced, not only Kurds, but Turkmen as well, who were kicked out by Saddam because he brought in Arabs, Shia Arabs from the rest of the country. And he created, in many ways, this problem that we have in Kirkuk. But in Kirkuk, the Turks have decided to bankroll, support something called the Iraqi Turkoman Front, which is a wholly owned subsidiary, if you want, of the Turkish General Staff. And they have become essentially, or they have the potential of becoming what Turkish Cyprus is to Turkey in northern Iraq. So that's the fate of the Turkmen, because the idea is that if the Kurds get Kirkuk, somehow the Turkmen will be suppressed, and therefore the Turks claim Kirkuk should never become Kurdish. Reason number three, and in fact this is the most important reason. The way things are going in Iraq, irrespective of the temporary success of the surge, the future of Iraq is still very much in doubt. We don't know where Iraq is going to end up. Things can work out, but if they don't, and anybody, if you were to be a betting person, you probably bet that things will not work out in Iraq ultimately, and we will pull out at some point. Right? Iraq may divide. Iraq may fall into a civil war. But even if the Kurds don't seek independence, which at the moment they've been very smart not to, force majeure, if there is a civil war between Sunnis and Shia, or any combination of Shia and Sunni forces, they're not all uniform, right? It may be that the Kurds will say, wait a minute, we don't want to be part of this. We're becoming independent. So the fear in Turkey is that if the Kurds of Iraq become independent, then Turkish Kurds will want the same things. That's a simple analogy. I mean, the truth is, it's possible, yes. Turkish Kurds may seek independence, may also seek to join northern Iraq. Northern Iraq can be an irredentist Kurdish state, all possible. But I will suggest to you that this is actually a complete misunderstanding of the situation by the Turkish leadership. But that's also in part because they don't know their own Kurds. There is really no communication between Turkish officialdom and the Kurdish population. It's two very separate entities in many respects. And I don't think, and I've talked a lot to Kurds over the years. Turkish Kurds, yes, some Kurds would want independence. Who wouldn't? I mean, if you're a Kurd, why shouldn't you? I mean, Kurds in Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey amount to 25 million people. Everybody has a state. Vanuatu has, everybody has a state. Why shouldn't 25 million who are really distinct people should not? But it is possible to to come up with some kind of understanding in all these countries without necessarily independence. But the fear of what may happen in northern Iraq has essentially frozen Turkish foreign policy. Take, for instance, the Kurdish regional government run by Mr. Barzani. This is a constitutional institution recognized by Baghdad. Baghdad deals with the north, talks to the KRG, the Kurdish region. The rest of the world talks to the KRG, except Turkey. Turkey refuses to recognize the KRG. Because if they recognize the KRG, then that means you're recognizing a Kurdish entity. Right? And this fear, coupled with the presence of the PKK in northern Iraq and in Turkey, coupled with a great deal of, again, political activism independent of the PKK in Turkey among Kurds. The problem that the Turks face is that the Kurdish genie is out of the bottle. And you cannot put it back in anymore. And this is one of the results of the Cold War. Now, so you're sitting in Ankara, and you're looking at all of this. And who is to blame for this? Washington. We went into Iraq, we messed it up. Already there was a Kurdish statelet in the north, but there was this understanding that that's what all it would be. And now, having messed up Iraq, we have brought the Kurdish state, an independent Kurdish state, closer to reality. So the real reason why you have a change in Turkey about the United States is this, because that Kurdish state attacks the insecurity that Turks feel about northern Iraq. Now, in a way, you can argue that that's not our problem, because we may have messed up Iraq, that's our problem, yes. I'm not shying away from that responsibility. But what happens in Turkey in terms of its own problems with the Kurdish population, it's Turkey's problems. Turkey messed it up. Right? And the irony, of course, is that when you look at Iraq per se, the United States and Turkey have exactly the same goals in Iraq. They both want a unified Iraqi state, a state that is capable of withstanding the big bad neighbor to the east, Iran. Right? They want a state that is economically viable, and with its oil resources, a powerhouse. Right? So, in that sense, they both want the same thing. Where they disagree, the two sides, is the internal governance, if you want, of Iraq. We have said, since Madeleine Albright brought the two Kurdish leaders to Washington in 1998 to have a peace agreement between them, we have said that we want a federal state, a federal Iraq, where the Kurds can have their own federal arrangement. But this is something the Turks don't want. And this is something the Turks do not, although now they're starting to say, well, maybe. The fact of the matter is, this is where the differences are. It's not that huge, but because we can't talk to each other, because we have, and this administration has done a terrible job of that, all you have to do is look at the Turkish press and look at what people say about Turkey. We went to Iraq for one reason only, to create a Kurdish state. Now, that's rather stupid, but that's what people say. Now, all these constituencies that I talked to you about, the Islamists, with the exception of the Kurds for the time being, the secularists and nationalists, they all have turned against us, and they all see something evil about our intentions. It's the creation of a Kurdish state. It's, some people accuse us of bringing the AKP to power, the AK party. But there's been an enormous vilification of the United States. And that's what explains, if you want, the 9% approval rating we have. And from that perspective, right, I think, and given what I hope was clear, given the changes that have taken place in the world, given the fact that there is no turning back on some kind of Kurdish entity in northern Iraq. One way or the other, there will be either an independent state or a federal Iraq. That's probably Kirkuk will mostly become Kurdish. But given all that, given the anxiety Turks feel about the resurgence also of Islam, given the fact that they don't seem to have to be able to control or influence all these changes that are taking place around them, right? This creates an enormous problem in Turkey. But here's the one interesting thing about Turkey, and that is that we have an establishment which is far more insecure than the government. The government is much more self-confident. The government has come to power, this government came to power with the idea that Turkey has always punched way below its weight internationally. And what you see is that they have made a very concerted effort to become active internationally. Sometimes they did the wrong thing, fair enough. Inviting the Hamas leader immediately after Hamas was, and the worst of the Hamas leaders, was probably not the smartest thing you want to do if you want to be an important player in the international system. But the point is that they went out of their way, they tried to get leadership of international institutions. They have made a great deal of progress. In a way, they feel much more secure. And I'll end on this point. And I said, things, to some extent, are going to get worse, but they're also going to get worse because of this looming new crisis we have. I suspect that the Turkish Supreme Court is going to close down the AKP and ban 30, 40 MPs and leaders from politics. And this is probably going to happen 6 to 8 months down the road, just when we are either going through a presidential transition, or in the first few days of the new president's term. I don't know how we're going to deal with this, because this crisis is unlike any other crisis we will have confronted with the Turks. Because on the one hand, we will sympathize with the political party that has been banned, which will come back in some way to power, but in a very different form. On the other hand, there are still very important equities that we have with the Turks precisely because of their location, whether it is still using the Incirlik air base for resupplying our troops in Iraq or in Afghanistan, or if it is this island of stability concept in a very unstable region, that there will be, I can see a major fight in Washington, in the new government, trying to say, what do we do now? And I don't know anybody has, people haven't started thinking about this because we have to deal with other issues. But I will submit to you that this is going to be the first test of the new president, and I have no idea how he or she will resolve it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henri. We're ready for your questions. We have a microphone right here. Let me just get the ball rolling. You gave us a very rich description of some of these fundamental problems in the relationship and these fundamental sources of Turkish angst, if you will, about the world in which they live. Let me ask you if you could sort of game out your last comment a bit more in terms of the potential banning of the AK Party. And I presume this would mean that the Prime Minister would be forced to step down, that Erdogan would be forced to step down. So can you talk a little bit more about that in terms of how you might see that playing out in terms of the AK Party reaction and so on? I mean, this is a party which has done very well in the elections. The polls I've seen have indicated they will do even better were elections to be held next month or next week or whatever. So perhaps you could talk a bit more about that.
Okay.
While people are collecting their questions.
Look, this upcoming crisis, forget about the Turkish-American relationship for a moment. What's going to happen in Turkey, to me, is very worrisome because it's a crisis like no other. Because we already know that since AK Party came to power in 2002, there have been many attempts on the part of the military to figure out a way to overthrow them. The Turkish press now has unearthed a number of real serious documents on generals trying to, not the chief of staff, but the chief of the services Air Force, Navy, and Land Forces and the Gendarmerie, trying to go around the Chief of Staff and have a coup. We also saw on the 27th of April of last year, when Abdullah Gül was nominated and it looked like he might win presidential election, we had a communique at midnight by the Turkish military trying to block that. We also now know that one of the top 4 generals called the Constitutional Court and said, you better stop this, back last year in, I don't want to go into details how to do it, but you better stop this election, otherwise we're going to coup. So there is a real civil-military conflict coming up in Turkey. If the party is banned, the party has 340 seats at the moment in parliament. The parliament has 550 seats, so you need 275 to form a government. I suspect they're not going to ban all. The 70 people they want to ban are all not all are MPs. So let's say 40 are MPs. So they will still have a majority, and the party will come up with another name and reform itself. I mean, Turks are very accustomed to party closing. So when you create a party, you also create a side party just in case. They call a tabela, sign party, so that you know you can go. But I don't know if any of you have seen AK Party's headquarters in Ankara. I mean, it's a state-of-the-art building. You come in, there are computers, people can log on and file complaints and stuff like that. They would lose all that. So all the assets of the party get seized. So the party becomes essentially moneyless the day after it gets banned. Even if they have something else they can start with, it's going to take time. But the loss of Erdogan is very significant. And this party is very much the creation, I should say, of Erdogan, and therefore I do not have a good sense of how people will react to this. Turks by and large don't demonstrate that much. I mean, there were periods where you had left-right-wing violence, but given the size of the population, it wasn't. But this is different. This is a party that won elections in 2007, and this victory in 2007 is a remarkable victory. Whether you may be opposed to the party, you may hate this party's whatever, but look, in 2002 they won 34% of the vote. This time they won 47% of the vote. No party in Turkey has increased its vote as an incumbent, ever. This is the largest percentage of votes a party has gotten since 1965, when Mr. Demirel's Justice Party got 53% of the vote. The only time an incumbent party increased its share of the vote was in 1954, when the Democrat Party increased its share of the vote from I can't remember, but 2 or 3 percentage points. This time they went from 34% to 47%. It was, and in many ways they won it because people perceived this party as having done a good job in terms of the economy managing. Turkey is a far more prosperous country. Sure, the international environment helped them a lot, but they have managed the economy, they have managed things rather well. And it's also a different style of governance than previous political parties. So, and also, I see sometimes articles say, oh, 47%, they got 47% of the vote, therefore 53% voted against them. That's not how the system works in Turkey. It doesn't mean that you vote. If you had 2 parties running, then you can say, well, so many people voted against you. People vote preferences. There are hundreds of parties who run in elections every time in Turkey. So it's a far more diverse society. The one interesting thing about Turkey, I have to say, Turkey transitioned into democracy in 1950. Between 1950 and today, depending how you want to count, we've had 3 real military coups, one what is called a postmodern coup in 1997. Last year we had this coup by memorandum, no, not coup by internet or whatever you want to call it. This year it's a judicial coup. I mean, you've had military interventions in politics many times. But what you do notice is that the Turkish public is far more democratic than its leadership. The Turkish public expects that you go to elections and you change governments. If you're unhappy with the people, you throw the bombs out. Right? There is an expectation. And every time you intervene in this process, the person who intervenes loses. In 1960, they overthrew a government and hung the prime minister. The first really free elections that came after that in 1965, the party that had backed the military coup was decimated. It's this continuation of the party that had been banned that won. 1971, the party that stood against the military won the 1973 elections. Similarly, 1980, the generals came out and they completely changed the political system. They created 2 political parties that were completely dependent on them, as they called them many times in public. They created the Yes Party and the Yes Sir Party. So this guy comes from left field, Turgut Özal, says, hey, I'm running too. And they tried to, the day before the election, the head of the junta goes on television and says to the people, say, you are not going to vote for Mr. Özal. What did people do? They voted for Mr. Özal. In 1997, they got rid of the coalition government, which was really a terrible coalition government, admittedly. And then they banned the Islamist Party. They said, the Islamist Party had, in the subsequent election, had gotten 15%. You divide that. They knew that by banning it, they would divide the party into 2. So 15 divided by 2, 7.5% each. So they stay below the 10% limit. What happened? It went up to 34%. So every time they have intervened, the public has reacted to it. Not because they don't like their soldiers or their officers or something like that, but they expect that if they elect somebody, that person has the right to serve. And you don't intervene. Now, this is the first time a governing party with such a huge support behind it is going to be banned. And its most important leader is going to be banned. What will happen after this, I don't know. I really, really don't know. One thing we know for sure, that if that happens, Turkey can say ciao to the European Union. European Union was far away anyway. I think everybody made a mistake by saying, in 8 years, in 10 years, Turkey will get into the European Union. That was never on the cards. The European Union project for Turkey is a generational issue. Perceptions have to change. The way things are done in Turkey have to significantly change before the Europeans say yes. But with this, Sarkozy will say, all Sarkozy has to say is, look, these guys are not ready. And he's won the argument.
Thank you, Professor Barkey, for your speech. My name is Ahmet Selim Tekelömer. I'm here a PhD student at Political Science Department here at BU. My question links the party closure case with Kurdish politics. If AKP is banned, and there is also a case that's against DTP, the main Kurdish party, and if they are banned as well, this means that Kurdish people who voted for 2 parties, who voted, I think, over 80% for 2 parties, their parties will be banned. That their votes will not be represented and they have no rights. What would this repercussion make any consequences in terms of Kurdish politics in Turkey? And would it change their perceptions of Turkish politics?
Well, in answering you, let me just elaborate on the point you raised. In the last elections in 2007, something very significant happened. AKP, as a Turkish party, admittedly moderate Muslim party, managed to get almost 50% of the votes in the Kurdish southeast. Kurds in the southeast voted for half of them voted for the AKP, the other half voted for the Kurdish Nationalist Party, the DTP, that's now in parliament. So the reason a lot of Kurds voted for the AKP is because AKP had signaled that it was ready to make changes on Turkey's Kurdish policy, not only with respect to domestic issues, but also with respect to northern Iraq. For Turkish Kurds, northern Iraq is very important. That doesn't mean that Turkish Kurds want to join northern Iraq. But for Turkish Kurds, how you treat the Iraqi Kurds is very important. When Turgut Özal offered, back in 1991, when he was president, he offered the Kurdish leaders, Talabani and Barzani, Turkish passport. He invited them to the presidential mansion. He treated them like regular human beings. Perceptions in Turkey about the Kurdish question among Kurds changed radically, and to this day, Özal is viewed as a great hero for the Kurds. What Erdogan started to signal is that there might be a change in the policy with respect to northern Iraq, because it is in fact the military that has prevented, and the nationalists who have prevented the Turkish government from talking to the KRG, to the Kurdish regional government. And the idea was, Erdogan, I think, understood what Özal had been trying to do, which is by appealing to Iraqi Kurds, try to reduce tensions in Turkey's Kurdish regions. If both parties are closed, right, because if AKP is closed, they will close DTP also. But they've played games in the past. Unfortunately, these judges are not judges, but they've played games in the past depending on what they've been told to do. They may not close DTP, but AKP will be closed. Nonetheless, I think the reaction in the Southeast is going to be pretty bad. I think to the extent that the AKP's Kurdish project is sabotaged, then you will see more violence, more demonstrations, more extreme nationalist activity. You decide who you want to give it to.
Why don't you
you want me to? Okay.
people? That's
All right, here.
easier, 'cause you would see them all
On that issue, hi, I'm Owen Schmidt.
On what?
Owen Schmidt.
I'm sorry, Owen Schmidt. Okay.
On the issue of so much of the population losing its representation, is it possible that Turkey will lose one of its assets, that its stability, with, I guess, the military going against the wishes of the people with all the coups and throwing out a party that's incredibly popular?
Well, that's a $64,000 question. What I'm saying is, unlike previous coups, this is different. We haven't faced, this is qualitatively different, not just because we're dealing with a party that is very popular, but it is an electorate that is far richer than previous electorates. One of the great changes that have taken place in Turkey since 1980 is that Anatolia, the non-Istanbul parts or the non-European parts of Turkey, have developed financially, industrially, a great deal. So you have a great deal more resources in Anatolia. You have a great deal more awareness, if you want. So what I don't know is how people will react. Now, the thing you have to remember is that the party will be banned, so they will form another party. They will still have, with let's say 40 or 50 members of parliament banned from politics, i.e. kicked out of parliament, they will still have enough seats in parliament to form the next government. And it's going to be called AKP Prime, AKP 2, or whatever they want to call it. So they will come back to power, but it's going to be a much weakened party. And I think that's the idea behind this case, is precisely to do that, to let AKP remain in another shape, but in a much weakened fashion, so that it doesn't do all these things that the establishment finds is against secularism, etc. Right? So they will come back, but they will be a much, much, much weaker party temporarily. Now, there is something else that can happen. We don't know, yet how AKP is going to defend itself against this case. They can go through the straight judicial system and defend it. But the problem is that if you read the indictment is a joke. I have never in my life, I read, it's this thick, I read the whole indictment. It consists of newspaper clippings where somebody, Erdogan or a member of the party is said by the newspaper to have said X. Maybe they did, completely out of context. So that's put in the indictment, and that's proof that they're trying to overthrow the secular order. There is a paragraph in the indictment. Remember, this is a legal document. Think of Supreme Court briefs that you may have seen in the papers. There is a paragraph in the indictment that talks about the relationship between the AKP and this religious order called the Gülenists. The last sentence reads something like, and they have even made they have even set up a relationship with the Gülen movement! ! Can you imagine the Supreme Court brief? You clearly see that the prosecutor is so exercised by this, in fact, that he has exclamation marks in his accusations. Colin Powell should not go to Turkey. He's an unindicted co-conspirator. Why? Because Colin Powell once, during the Iraq War, he was asked a question and he said, Turkey is a model moderate Muslim country, which on the surface is factually correct. Everybody in Turkey took this, the United States is trying to impose a Muslim model on Turkey. The prosecutor uses a quote by Colin Powell as proof. The fact that Colin Powell said this, that means that the AKP has turned Turkey into a non-secular country. It is not an indictment. It is a farce. You read it and you laugh or you cry, depending on your perception. If it was in English, I would have sent it to The Daily Show. The point I'm saying is that, so it depends how they will defend themselves. I don't think they can defend themselves against this on the legal basis. They can do a couple of other things. They can try to change the constitution and make it more difficult for political parties to be closed. The problem is, can you retroactively change the constitution? Can you change the constitution and cover yourself? And there, it is very clear that the two main opposition parties are not going to let them do it. And they can go to a referendum. You change the constitution. If you don't get 2/3 of the votes in parliament on a constitutional change, you can go for a referendum and let the people decide. But they won't get there, because I suspect what will happen is those two parties will go to the Constitutional Court and say the referendum is illegal, and this Constitutional Court is going to say, yes, you're right, the referendum is illegal. That avenue is closed, okay? So that's avenue number 2. Avenue number 3 is what I call the nuclear option. And the nuclear option is you go to the polls. And current polls show that they will come back with a much larger percentage of the polls. It will be an incredible embarrassment for the military, for the judiciary, etc. That doesn't mean that they won't stop them from being banned, but it will. The reason I call it the nuclear option is now there's a chance that there might be violence, all right? In which case, then the military moves in. So, I don't know. I really, really don't know. Maybe a year from now, somebody will be here and say, they think everything worked out so well. We all live happily ever after. I really, really don't know. This gentleman wonders.
Hi, my name is Turgay Ertürk. Erdogan, when he came to power, first he was more seeking approval and middle ground. But after he got 47%, he became a different person. And one best example is the headscarf business. They passed Furthermore, Erdogan stopped doing anything about EU reforms. We understand that EU was hostile and I would say a little racist towards Turkey too, but that doesn't mean that Erdogan should not continue on with the planned reforms. And one of the things, 301, in fear of the fascist or near-fascist party, they couldn't change this. I mean, this is, and Mehmet Ali Brand, as you know, he says if he did these things, especially some reforms, he wouldn't be in that condition. So I would like to have your comments.
It is true that Erdogan, after the second election, has not pushed on European reforms as he did in the first. They took. It's hard to say why they didn't do it. I think there was a little bit of hubris. I think they were bidding that time. They were so sure that now with 47% they'll be able to do many more things. But when you look at why this court case has come about, remember, the people who are bringing the court case are also the same people who are against any EU reforms, are also against changing the law that you mentioned, 301, which is a law against free speech. The two reasons that I put forward are Abdullah Gül's election to the presidency. Now, Abdullah Gül has been in parliament since 1993. He's well known everywhere. He's been foreign minister. He's been prime minister at one point. He has, you may agree or disagree with him, but he has nothing wrong except for one thing. His wife wears a headscarf. And by elevating him to the presidency, what AKP effectively did was to put a woman with a headscarf in the office, or shall we say not the office, but in the residence of the father of the nation, Atatürk. And that's an unbearable sin. Right? And that's what, the irony of course is, the reason there were elections in July is precisely because of the crisis over the presidency. That AKP wanted Abdullah Gül, they were blocked, they went to the people, they came back with a much larger majority. I mean, they can say, look, the people have spoken. Clearly, if they didn't want Abdullah Gül to be president, they wouldn't have voted for us. So legitimacy is on their side on that issue. But when you hear the opposition say, well, they didn't go for the middle way, they put Abdullah Gül. Abdullah Gül is a particular, very reasonable guy. The other issue is the one you referred to, the headscarves. In Turkey, you can't wear a headscarf. And this is also relatively new, by the way, not only in official locations. I mean, in other words, you can't work for the government and wear a headscarf. You can't be a member of parliament and have a headscarf. You can then wear a headscarf and you come to parliament, you take it off. Then you can go in. But the other place where you can't wear a headscarf is in universities. And what AKP did was to try to change the constitution in such a way as to allow women to get an education by saying, you're not going to wear the headscarf anywhere else, but you can wear it in university. Now, look, there are two opinions here. There are people who say, this is a slippery slope, you let them in university, then you let them in elsewhere. It's a valid argument. The slippery slope argument has been used for many things in this country elsewhere. The other way of looking at it is to say, why are you denying education to women who you will have potentially an impact, actually, to change their mind? Because there have been all these studies and all these books that have been written in Turkey that shows you that some of the women who don a headscarf don it because to them it's really a means of an emancipation. Emancipation from whom? from their father, from their mother, but especially from the father and the brothers. Because as long as you wear the headscarf, you're safe, so you can go outside the home and have a job or go to university. So if that woman goes to university, ultimately she might get rid of the headscarf. Maybe she won't. We don't know. But something like 60 to 70% of women in Turkey wear a headscarf. So you have essentially excluded the large bulk of women from wearing headscarf. Now, is this reasonable? I mean, I think this is something that can be debated. Look, I have friends of mine who are alarmed. I mean, I can't tell you. I mean, the emails you get or the conversations you have with people who say, this is it, this is the end. And they cheer on the prosecutor for trying to close the party just on this ground alone. But imagine, I mean, the prime minister's children had to come to the United States to get an education because they couldn't get it in their own country. Now, that says something about the nation. But fundamentally, it's not the headscarf. Fundamentally, it's this fight over what secularism in Turkey means. There are two interpretations of secularism. One is a very hard-line laicist, and the other one, you can still be secular a la United States. I mean, there are no women wearing here a headscarf, but does it bother you if somebody wears a headscarf in class? No, I mean, I've had students. You have people wearing Sikh turbans. But I mean, this is someplace where, I mean, this is an issue of where people can have different opinions, but I don't think you close a political party because you want to let women go to university. I mean, there's something a little bit bizarre about this. And finally, I don't think that if AKP, look, I criticized AKP, and you've read the article I wrote about this, for not going and doing more reforms. I mean, they're always Johnny-come-lately when it comes to these kind of things. That they should have moved on 301. They should have moved on the Kurdish issue sooner. They should have moved on the Constitution. The first thing they should have done after the elections was to change the Constitution. I mean, this is a 1982 Constitution which was written by the military, which is a straitjacket. I'll give you one example. I mean, this is partly, it's not the Constitution itself, but it's the way the laws and the judicial system work. One of my best friends is the deputy editor of a brand new newspaper called Taraf. Maybe some of you don't know. You know, the Turks had a military intervention, ground operation in northern Iraq, and one of Turkey's most important and most colorful persons is a man-woman by the name of Bülent Ersoy, who's somebody who was a man and became a woman. Very outlandish. She, in a television interview, said, well, if I had children, and you know I can't have children, she said, I wouldn't have sent my children to the military. Boom, the next day she was charged with inciting people against the military, blah, blah, blah. It's a big crime in Turkey. The newspaper, Taraf, my friend who's the deputy editor and the editor, wrote a column saying, you know, Bülent Ersoy, you're 100% right. They got called in by the local prosecutor and charged for abetting a crime. They said, but excuse me, how can you charge us with abetting a crime when you just charged this entertainer, you haven't proved that she has actually committed a crime, and you are charging us with abetting a crime that hasn't been proven yet? Basically, their answer was, we know we're going to find her guilty, but we didn't want to lose, what's the expression, time. No, the statute of limitations, thank you. So we want to charge you 9 so that when we find that the other person guilty, we'll be able to find you guilty. I mean, this is perverse. This gentleman has a question.
I had a question about Turkey's relationship with its two Shiite neighbors. I think it's interesting that Turkey, a Sunni majority country, is basically handling this Kurdish question in dealing with two Shiite neighbors, Iraq and Iran, and Shiite neighbors with very different principles of at the heart of how they see the role of religion in politics, the al-Maliki government, and being more skeptical of the principle of religion, or clerics having a role in the government than obviously the Iranian regime is. And I'm just wondering if that Sunni-Shia split matters at all when Turkey is discussing Kurdish issues with Iran and Iraq. It may not matter at all. But if it does, if the distinction between the two governments matters, does Turkey have better relations with one or the other?
That's a great question because, the answer is, it's the Kurds, stupid. Not you. But because that trumps everything else. Now, earlier, when I was arguing, if you look at American and Turkish interests in Iraq, the other thing they both want is, when I say a stable Iraq, they don't want a fundamentalist Iraq, whether it's a Sunni or Shia fundamentalist. They don't want another Iran in Iraq. The truth, historically, the Turks have had very uneasy relationship with the Iranians. But when it comes to the Kurdish question, everything else gets forgotten. That trumps everything else. So Iran, which has in the past was accused of fomenting troubles in Turkey, supporting extremist violence, etc., gets a pass when it comes to dealing with the PKK. And this is not coming from a, shall we say, moderate Muslim government, the AKP, that's saying this, but it is also the military and intelligence services in Turkey who have a much more positive view of Iran than they have of the United States. The big danger in the long run between the United States and Turkey is also the fact that the military has become very anti-American. We talk about the Turkish-American military relationship is very robust. That's nonsense. I can go, a couple of events that happen which are interesting to talk about. But between Maliki and Iran, the Maliki government, to them, is suspicious because, first of all, the titular head of Iraq is a Kurd, Talabani. There are many Kurds in the foreign minister. Deputy Prime Minister are leading Kurds in that government. So and that government has actually talked sometimes with both sides of its mouth, criticizing the Turks for intervening in Iraq, but maybe also saying, that's fine, you can do it. But between the Iranians and the Maliki government, they would choose the Iranians if there was a choice. But they don't need to choose. The other irony here is that the Turkish relationship with Syria has blossomed. But between 1980 and 1999, for 19 years, Abdullah Öcalan directed the PKK from Damascus and the Bekaa Valley. Right? The Syrians kicked him out when the Turks threatened them in 1998. So despite that 18 years of actively supporting the PKK, today the relations are hunky-dory. The relations with the United States are not, because the Turks are upset that we have not done anything about the PKK presence in northern Iraq, given the fact that we are the occupying power in Iraq, which is a valid criticism. I'm not saying that's not a valid criticism, but given what else is going on in Iraq, this is clearly not a priority. Things have gotten better because now we let them intervene in Iraq. We give them intelligence, and they've done military operations in Iraq. But again, if you ask the average Turk, if you look at opinion polls, Iran and Syria are here and we're here. Yet we are the ones who gave Öcalan to Turkey on a silver platter. We don't get any credit for it. And what sometimes Turks don't understand is that Americans at least official Americans get quite annoyed because we have spent enormous amount of, and I know because in the government I saw that stuff. We spend enormous amount of resources tracking down not just Öcalan but other PKK guys, trying to help the Turks. We pushed the Europeans to declare the PKK a terrorist organization. We have done things for Turkey that the Turks take for granted and never acknowledge. I'm not saying that we are perfect, by no means. Right? We should have done other things after we invaded Iraq in terms of northern Iraq and the PKK that we could have done, and we didn't do it. But that's purely the failure of imagination on the administration that found itself in a war it couldn't win, and literally freaked out. Oh, I'll come back.
My name is Nejat Anas, a political geography student in Oklahoma University.
You're far away from home.
Yes, I came to a geographers conference, but I heard
I thought
you
you
were
came for
speaking
me to
here.
listen to
Yeah,
me.
yeah. I know that you understand Turks better than Turks. My question is, I'm basing my questions on assumption that the Democrats will win the 2008 election. Where would you put Armenian genocide issue in regarding to U.S.-Turkey relationship?
You're assuming that the Democrats will win, you said?
That's my bad assumption.
Hey, you're not going to get an argument from me on that, but of the three candidates, I mean, the Turks, I think, are rooting for McCain for that purpose and that purpose only, that reason only, is because McCain has refused to endorse the Armenian genocide resolution. The two other candidates, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, have both endorsed the Armenian genocide resolution. In some ways, it's domestic politics, which I was saying. Domestic politics plays a bigger role. The Armenians have traditionally voted Democratic. They don't vote. They're known as a Democratic constituency, so it's more natural that the Democratic candidates are going to try to seek their votes by promising to pass the Armenian genocide resolution. But I think the Armenian genocide resolution is dead for a while. It's not going to come up. It doesn't matter who wins. Even Obama or Hillary were to become president, the Armenian genocide resolution is not going to come back. It created a huge furor in the halls of Congress, and I have friends who were involved in this issue, and they tell me that it doesn't look like something has to happen. Now, look, Turkey can lose a great deal of credibility if it goes around and bans the governing party. Circumstances may change things, may make it easier, may make it more difficult for the administration to defend Turkey. I suspect, look, I was in government in 2000 when the Clinton administration fought very hard to block the Armenian resolution from coming to a congressional vote. Even though he had promised that he was going to pass it, because national, right, they all do. So Hillary or Barack, same. I think it's not going to change unless there's a change in Turkey. If you have a military government, you know that the Armenian community is going to bring this up in a jiffy, and this time it might pass, and people will take the consequences.
Two final questions.
All right, that lady over there.
Hi, I'm Jocelyn Cesari from Harvard University. My question is, due to the political, national and international circumstances you described, how would you interpret the initiative coming from the government to reform or revise the Hadith? It came at the forefront of the news, especially in Europe, more than in the US. But how would you interpret this initiative that is a state initiative, actually?
I'm not sure it's a state initiative. Is it a state initiative?
Committee under the state initiative, yeah.
I have to confess, I don't know much about it, but if it has support from the government, which I'm not sure it does, it's very interesting because it kind of shows you how this Turkish government or this Turkish political party thinks of Islam, and especially Turkey's role in world Islam. The Turks really do want to kind of be at the forefront of change in the Islamic world. Abdullah Gül, for instance, very proudly, I've known him for many years. I remember talking to him a couple of years ago where he said very proudly, he told me, "Did you see my speech in Tehran at the Organization of Islamic Conference?" I said no, and I made sure that I saw it afterwards. But it was all about pushing for democracy and using Turkey as a model of democratic country that can be. So in that sense, it falls in line, but I have to confess, I don't know.
Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. And I was just curious, you had a very telling quote on an NPR a little while ago that you seem to have reaffirmed today here, and that Kurds in Turkey are really not looking to secede, and that they're looking for smaller measures like being able to give their children Kurdish names and have their own Kurdish language broadcasts. I was wondering if you could shed some light as to why Ankara has been unwilling to meet these rather simplistic demands. It seems like it would almost galvanize opinion against them.
Why Ankara hasn't done it, in part, it has to do with let me say, I mean, I said earlier today that for many people, even talking about the Kurds is really a shock. Right? Look, the word Kurd, the only way you talked about Kurds, if you lived in Istanbul, was you knew there were certain types of trades that were controlled by Kurds. So if you had to deal with those, you dealt with these Kurds. But otherwise, there was no conversation. All conversation about Kurds happened behind closed doors in the government, with security services, etc., who were very... And people didn't travel that much to the southeast, etc. So suddenly you're confronted with this issue. So it's really a shock, because for many years, the Turkish state went out of its way to say that there is no such thing as Kurds, officially. And to this day, I mean, you can read military textbooks, the stuff that is being taught in military academies, they still make that claim, right? So in that sense, there's an enormous amount of resistance to A, accepting that fact, one. Two, there is this fear, and it comes back. I mean, the Turkish socialization process is such that the one thing that you keep seeing over and over is that the West wants to repeat the 1920 Sèvres Treaty. There is something called the Sèvres syndrome that you get socialized into, that everybody is out there to destroy you because they tried to do it in 1920. So there is empirical evidence, right? So talk about Kurds is bringing back the 1920. It happens, of course, in the 1920 Sèvres Treaty. There was talk not of an independent state, but of an autonomous Kurdish region in Anatolia for the Kurds. So that also fits nicely. But the problem in Turkey, and this is actually, that's why I mean Europe is so far away in some respects. You are taught in Turkey that the West conspired and brought down the Ottoman Empire, and the ultimate crowning achievement of that conspiracy was the Sèvres Treaty. Nobody in Turkey that I know has ever asked themselves, yes, this was the Ottoman what? Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire at one point stretched all the way to Vienna, had all of the Middle East. And how did they go to Vienna? On frequent flyer miles? Knocked on doors and says, can we come in and take over your territory? The truth is, this was an empire. Empires come and empires go. Then World War I turned out to be the end of a number of empires, right? So there is, when the Turks talk about the Westerners, i.e. the French Empire, the British Empire conspiring against them, it was a fight between empires. Nobody talks about, sure, look at the Serbs. The Serbs are the only country, the only nation I know who still talk about 1389 when they lost the war to the Ottomans, and that to them is still the most defining moment in their history. But the truth of the matter, think of it from a Serb point of view. They still think that they are traumatized by 1389 the same way the Turks are traumatized by 1920. But there is no realization that the Ottoman Empire came to an end because it was an empire. And other empires, yes, conspired, but they did the same thing. I mean, they did not invite themselves into Hungary. In 1526, there was a Battle of Mohacs, a ferocious battle, where the Turkish military decimated the Hungarian army. It was a brilliant battle. I mean, if you look at it from a battle tactics, it was a brilliant maneuver. That's how they got to Hungary, right? So that's the problem in Turkey. I mean, they haven't. I mean, every day you can read the newspapers and in all the books that official books that are taught in school, the Sèvres Treaty and the Sèvres Syndrome, how the West is trying to divide us. At some point, somebody has to come up in Turkey and say, wait a minute, we did the same thing. And instead of being proud of the fact that out of this mess that the Ottoman Empire was, Turkey emerged as with all its problems today, it's still a flourishing country. As I said earlier, it's a country where democracy has taken hold everywhere except the bureaucracy and the opposition party. It's a country that, in 1980 was only exporting $2 billion worth of goods, now has passed $100 billion. You go to Europe, your television you turn on is made in Turkey. The refrigerators are made in Turkey. I mean, an amazing change has happened. Instead of being proud about this, the Turks are still wallowing about Sèvres. It doesn't make sense. Can I take one more? Okay.
Go ahead, please.
He's had enough of me, so.
We'll have an opportunity to ask some questions informally while we have some refreshments together. But, Henri, I want to thank you very much for truly a very rich presentation, extremely provocative and worrying in some ways, and I must say rather formidable to think about in terms of the next administration's agenda having to deal with this kind of crisis. So you've given us an awful lot to think about. And I want to thank you for making the journey from Pennsylvania by way of D.C. to Boston. And please join me in thanking Professor Henri Barkey for a very fine presentation.
Thank you.